From one mid-quality arcade port to a slightly better one, and one that was made much earlier. Also, note to self, never say mid again in that fashion. You sound like a... Strider, the Capcom arcade classic from 1989, eventually brought over to home platforms where you had a couple interesting choices around that time. On the one hand, you had Strider on the Nintendo Entertainment System, a somewhat open-ended action platformer riddled with some problems, to put it mildly. We touched on this previously. On the other hand, you have Strider on Sega Genesis, quite possibly the best home conversion of the arcade game until emulation became a thing on the home console front. And anyone from Europe who wants to argue that their port on their Amstrad 64 ST-ZX Spectrum holobyte computer system of some sort is superior to the examples mentioned above can choke on their sausage rolls. You guys had a billion home computer versions courtesy of TierTex and they're all shite. Fuck off, you twats. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, Strider on Genesis. Anyway, you play as Hiryu, a member of the Striders or future ninja people, and you're tasked with assassinating the Grand Master and free the world of his rule. This involves venturing through 5 stages of slicing and dicing the opposition with your Cypher Plasma sword thing, as well as running, jumping, and climbing almost every climbable thing there is to climb in Strider, which is a lot and something that is fairly easy to do, but still somewhat challenging to truly grasp and master. Which is a step above the other Strider game we played years ago, which is just... well, the less said the better, and I already spent... how much time did I spend on that thing? Almost 9 minutes spent talking about Strider on NES back in 2023, if you want to check that out. Review number 947, which is one of the rare occasions I will actually point that out in one of these things, whereas I just normally... Anyway, Strider on Genesis isn't something that needs that much time dwelling into. It's more or less a straight arcade conversion with no real extras or anything of the sort. The closest you get is an option menu that toggles the difficulty, the number of starting lives, and you even have a sound test to listen to those sweet, sweet Strider tunes. In terms of the overall experience, if you've played the arcade original, this Mega Drive port is more or less the same deal. Not quite the same, obviously, but close enough, and that's all it really needed to be. Strider tends to be straightforward to get into. You have a sword with a long reach that can be upgraded to have an even longer reach. You have power-ups that can grant you a health, 1-up, and even a drone thing to help you out. You could climb most walls and ceilings, of which you'll need to make use of in order to overcome the Grandmaster's forces, which vary from robot things to ninja things and bootleg Soviets. Now the good news is that controlling Strider isn't that much of an issue since controls are fairly responsive, and once you get the hang of how Strider moves around, particularly managing his rather painful leaps, which are unfortunately an arcade trait and not a port issue, it shouldn't be a problem to managing the other bits, the climbing and stuff, which is good because Strider, being a game of arcade origins, can get pretty challenging at times, given that you have a health meter that won't last long if you're not careful. Needless to say, it tends to be iffy at times, but nothing that repetition and memorization cannot solve. Graphically, Strider looks great for the most part. There are fewer colors than the arcade version, some missing scrolling effects, some minor bits of animation is omitted, the heads-up display now has a black bar behind it, and there's occasional bouts of sprite flickering and some slowdown here and there, but other than that, the game looks tremendous for an early Genesis title, managing a fairly close approximation of the arcade visuals with some mild compromises here and there. A pity that this wasn't a Sega first-party launch title, because something like this would have been a better packing title for the Genesis than Altered Beast, for example. Not only does it look like the arcade game, but the game is actually fun to play once it stops kicking your ass. Eventually. The sound output isn't too bad. Some of the sound effects might be a bit tinny sounding and lacking that bit of punch, but on the flip side, the arcade tracks have been given respectable recreations on this here Mega Drive port, which is nice because Strider has some pretty sweet tunes on here. Though personally, I prefer the NES tracks. The game's a mess, but its chiptunes are splendid. The Genesis port does a fine job with the arcade tracks, and now that I think about it, I actually prefer the Mega Drive takes over the arcade ones, which felt a bit tinny at times to me, and maybe I should stop there. I'll stop there and okay, let's just move on. Overall, and forgive the cliche, but I feel it applies here, Strider on Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Provided players with a quality Strider outing at home, and one that not only plays well, but is also not riddled with lots of glitches and poor design choices that render the whole thing virtually unplayable and utterly worthless. No, Strider was done well on the old Mega Drive, and is as good of a home conversion as you could have gotten back in the day. And even today, it still holds up as a solid take on a beloved arcade classic, which explains why it's part of the Nintendo Classics service or included in one of the Genesis mini-things. The arcade original is available to play in some form or fashion, but this ain't too shabby either. This got the job done, and it's great.